So today we're going to talk about cellular respiration. What do we remember about cellular respiration? Well, respiration, the basic idea of it is breaking down carbs into a form of energy. So today we're going to focus on what are the basics to this process, what are the basic steps to respiration, what are some types of energy, and how do we actually capture or harness that energy, So thinking about energy, there's many types of energy. There's thermal energy and radiant energy. And both of those can come from the sun. But we also have what's called kinetic energy, which is the movement of molecules that's created by the movement of molecules. We have potential energy, which is stored energy. And we also have chemical energy, which is energy that's stored in the bonds. And this will come actually in the form of ATP. And ATP is an energy storage molecule. Okay. We're really going to focus on today the kinetic, potential, and chemical energy. So first of all, starting with kinetic energy, the motion, the movement of those molecules are creating the energy. And this picture is a really good example showing you that energy that's going into reaction, movement here is kinetic energy. When you're at the top and you're storing that potential energy before you can roll down the hill and release energy, again having more kinetic energy. When energy is moving into a system, we actually call that an endergonic reaction. Endergonic. That should sound familiar because we mentioned that before when we were talking about enzymes. And endergonic energy is coming in, and usually that's to build or synthesize. Molecules. This is also known as anabolism. Okay? Energy going in for the reaction to occur. On the other hand, kinetic energy that is releasing energy that's going out, is called exergonic or exiting. And this is when you're going to be breaking something down. So breaking down or digesting. This is also known as catabolism. Okay. So energy going in, endergonic, energy coming out of a reaction, exergonic, building and breaking down, both kind of forms of kinetic energy, molecules are being moved. We also have potential energy where energy is stored. And actually, this chemical energy found in ATP, the energy molecule that stores energy, is actually going to be found within the high energy bonds between those phosphate groups. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, 3 phosphate groups. Energy is going to be within the bonds, and one thing we really need to know about these bonds is that they are actually weak, and they can actually be easily broken. Or I shouldn't say weak, but they're definitely easily broken. Because they are easily broken, this ATP molecule can actually be recycled. ATP can actually be formed by ADP, adenosine diphosphate, 2 phosphate groups, plus adding an inorganic phosphate, P of I, and we can actually create another ATP or build another ATP molecule. In the reverse reaction, ATP, when we want to release energy, here are our 3 phosphate groups, we can actually break off that 3rd phosphate group, and when we break off that 3rd phosphate group, that high energy bond will release energy. And remember that the energy is between those electrons. Phosphate groups, PO4, remember, are charged, and that charge is another reason for that energy being able to be released. So now that we've talked about those energy molecules, we want to look at a little, very briefly, what is energy used for? So in this picture here, we're actually showing you the sliding filament theory. And this is actually all about the movement of muscles. How do we move our muscles? What they're showing you in this diagram, even though it's really, really faint, is up here you have this protein. This protein molecule will bind with, or actually an ATP molecule, will bind with the protein. Once it binds with the protein, it causes the protein to shift and have a shape change. And when it does that, it'll actually cause the sliding motion that allows for the movement of your muscles. So when you're thinking about that, one thing that we have to keep in mind is that when we're talking about work, most of the work that we need to do is to move, is the movement of proteins. And if a protein moves or changes shape, remember that this is called a conformational change. Usually these shape changes, remember, are not permanent, and they can just change for the time being and revert back once that receptor molecule, or that ligand molecule detaches. It can release it, and the protein can go back to its original shape. Besides just moving proteins, although that's a big reason why we need energy, because that's going to do a lot of work in our body, we're also going to use it to build or synthesize molecules. So moving proteins and building up molecules, synthesizing molecules, are two major reasons why we need energy. But how do we get that energy that we need? How do we get that ATP? Well, here you see kind of the basic outline of respiration. Okay? So these are the basics. You have your food molecule, especially with animals, that you're going to eat and digest to break down. When you break it down, you're going to break it down into glucose, which is our monomer of our carbohydrate. And we're going to take in some oxygen. It's going to go through our mitochondria, and we're going to produce energy, which is our main purpose here, some water, and some CO2. So in this, we're going to have our reactants, our glucose and our oxygen going through our organelle, the mitochondria, and we're going to talk about those different steps that must occur, and produce the final products at the very end. Okay? Now we're going to look at this process in a little more detail. So when we're looking at the main equation for cellular reproduction, cell respiration, one thing you want to remember is that in cell respiration or cellular respiration, the energy is in the bonds. Of the sugar molecule. And what you're going to do is you're going to take the sugar molecule and you're going to transfer that energy to ADP. Transfer that energy to ADP, and eventually you're going to produce your ATP. So we have the oxygen molecule that we breathe in, and later on we're going to talk about how this is a final electron acceptor. We'll talk about what that means later. We have our sugar molecule, which is C6H12O6, the chemical formula for it. And remember that all the energy that's in the sugar is because of the electrons within the bonds. Okay, that's how we're getting energy to power this reaction and to eventually make our ATP. We have our carbon dioxide and water, which just happen to be waste products that are made as a result. And then we have our main energy compound. Now we do need to go back and do a little chemistry and think about a little chemistry before we can actually talk about what happens during cell respiration. So one main thing that we need to know is how do we transfer the electrons? Well, with the transfer of electrons, you might remember redox, okay? Redox stands for reduction and oxidation. In a reduction reaction, what's actually happening is you gain electrons, and in an oxidation reaction, you actually lose electrons. Two things that can help you remember this is Leo the lion goes grr. Okay, Leo the lion goes grr. Lose electrons, that's oxidation. Gain electrons, that's reduction. And that is an R over there. Okay? When we're looking at this picture, we don't need to pay attention to what's up top here. Okay? What we want to really look at are the pictures and what they're showing us. On the left-hand side, you have this A molecule, and it is actually losing its electrons at the very end. Because it is losing its electrons, it's being oxidized. And when it loses electrons, it actually becomes more positive. Okay? On the other hand, you have this B molecule. The B molecule doesn't start off with electrons, but it ends up gaining electrons. Because it's gaining electrons, it's being reduced. And when you become reduced, you actually become more negative. Keep in mind that this molecule right here, because it's gaining electrons, it's known as an electron carrier. And this will be very important later on when we talk about the process. But it's actually going to carry it to what's known as the electron transport chain. And we're going to learn that this is where most of the ATP is going to be made within the mitochondria. Then we have our three main stages of respiration. So the three main stages of respiration are, first of all, glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain itself. Remember, that's where most of the energy is going to be made. Now, what we're looking at here is that there's actually two ways to make ATP. We have what's known as substrate level phosphorylation. What you're doing there is you're taking an ADP molecule and adding in an inorganic phosphate, that's what the I stands for, to make your ATP molecule. And then what you're actually going to see happening is we're literally transferring phosphates. Then we also have another way to make ATP, which is by oxidative phosphorylation. And this actually is going to be through a process called chemiosmosis. And we're going to talk about how that works later on. In the next section, we're going to look at how our electrons transfer. And you're just going to see a very basic outline of how electrons are transferred through these different proteins and how pumps are going to be used. But we'll talk about that later in class.